This is episode 18 for the World Builder's Anvil. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. I'm your host, as always, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's continue our little journey together. And today, I'm a little trepid. I'm going to talk about evolution. And I like using that word, one, because hopefully it's a bit of a clickbait, so people will come check out the episode because they're either an evolution person who supports evolution or religion in the world, and maybe they'll listen to what I'm talking about and they'll get a little less stressed out over that fight and get off into a fake world discussion and start enjoying life a little bit more. Now, I like talking about evolution, but when I talk about, I'm not talking strictly about the scientific theory of evolution. I'm just talking about the idea of things changing over time. Some things take a very long time to change. Other things will change much more rapidly, and really due to environmental reasons and sometimes other reasons, but some things will change really slowly and other things will change over a short term. So let's get right into it. First thing I want to talk about is species evolution. How do species evolve? And there are tons of great documentaries about this kind of evolution, and this is what I think a lot of people think about when you use the word evolution, or is life-changing, and the idea of the strongest, or that's what people's perception is, the strongest continue and the weaker die off, and they adapt and change over time, and over a period of millions or billions of years, or as long as they exist as a species, they keep changing. Although when the changing becomes too much, it's a rapid shift, and typically you consider a new species at that point. So really, the species is how life forms sort of break up over time. And if all life is related, then plant life and animal life have to be related at some point, and they split off. And some things became more like animals to survive, and some things became more like plants to survive. And I'm probably wrong on that, so please don't call Richard Dawkins and have him call me and explain it to me correctly, because this is just a basic idea of what I'm talking about. And then, you have different branches of species. Mammals break off and lizards break off. Sometimes things die out. New things come out of nature or religion, if that's the way you want to believe it. However, the idea is over time, and it takes a really long time for these things to get sculpted. So humans today did not exist even 100,000 years ago, I don't think. I've heard some arguments that humans today are different species than humans of even 10,000 years ago. Whether that's true or not is kind of irrelevant. It's a labeling thing that we put to species. And species is really just labels that we create. And I don't think we always agree on what the labels specifically mean anyway. But in the same way species evolve, your races would evolve too. So if you have an alien race, or you have humans, or you have, like many fantasy worlds, elves and orcs and halflings, and I can't say another word because I would be sued by intellectual property people maybe. But these things would develop over time. And if you want to come from more of a creation mythos, they might begin at a certain spot that you want them to be, but they're going to be changed by the environment and everything that happens. But over such a long period of time, it's probably not going to impact the story unless there's a major event that causes a genetic mutation during the story. Chemicals evolve. So let's look at a sun. For the most part, it starts with hydrogen, and then it'll evolve, and it will start having helium inside, and it'll work up to even heavier metals. Then it'll explode and spread them out across the universe. So really, even the way chemicals come about themselves is through an evolutionary process. It takes a long time. There probably was no helium or anything bigger than hydrogen very early in the universe if it evolved from the Big Bang. Plants, much like species, take a long time to evolve. I know they can do changes and make new species now a little bit more quickly, probably over the scope of a couple generations of stuff. They can create a new line of roses or a new line of lilac trees. So when technology or magic is to a sufficiently advanced enough place, you can actually start affecting evolution on a quicker scale. Geology obviously develops over time. The more pressure that is put on a material, the harder it becomes. The less pressure, the softer it becomes. The more likely it is to blow away or evolve or be washed away and turn into a river. So geology is another thing that over a long period of time will happen to your world. So if you live in a world where there's a lot of hard rock, there had to be, at least at some point, really hard pressure put on that to help create that. And in places that didn't have, or in places that like swamps where they've not yet had the pressure on them, it's soft, it's mucky, there's a lot of water that will sit and mix in there. Maybe it turns into a river. The cosmos, I touched this a little bit when I talked about cosmos, so I'm not going to get into a lot here. Things happen over time. When a star explodes, it's throwing material back out there, which is going to start gathering back up because of gravity in different spots. Maybe a new star forms, maybe a smaller stars form, maybe brown dwarfs or planets will form around existing stars. I don't really know the process, but over time. But the one thing in common here is most of these things that I've just talked about are probably not something that's going to ever really get covered in your world. So, there probably wasn't a day where the human ancestor gave birth to the first human and they're like, oh, there's a new species and start dealing with it. And that's not to say you couldn't have a story like that. One of my favorites, A Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, kind of gets into a new species of humans coming about. So there are ways you can kind of achieve that. But in a natural process, you're probably not going to deal much with these in the world, except maybe you start noticing a little different behavior from the dogs or a little bit of a different behavior from, the plant starts to eat people. Oh, hey, how come that plant is eating 2 people now? You would notice the new species starting to arrive. But you're really not going to see a huge expansion or a huge growth of something unless there's an unless you come up with a good reason for it to happen in a quicker pace than it should. Now, on the shorter term, things can evolve much more quickly. A lot of cultures evolve kind of rapidly. They would start as this one-based culture. They would migrate across the world. And as they spent more time apart, they would break off into different cultures. That's why you have these proto-cultural groups like the Indo-European cultural group and all kinds of different major cultural groups that broke down into smaller cultures. And a lot of that just deals with the belief systems that arrive up based off of the new locations they live in, the new stimulus that they have to explain. States can evolve and go away very quickly. And an intern government sort of came up before the Soviets took over during World War I from the czars. So you have this state that kind of appears and goes away very quickly. Eastern Germany kind of appeared right after World War II, and then in the 90s it went away. Some states can be around for long periods of time, and sometimes even when they are, they're not really. Like if you look at like a China or an England, they are nothing the same today. Well, I shouldn't say nothing, but the governments of those countries are nothing the same as they were several thousand years ago. Well, in the case of China, several thousand years ago. 1,000 years ago for the case of England. Languages evolve constantly. As you come up with new ideas, new things that you need to explain, you come up with new words. That's a language evolving. That could happen very easily in a story, where a language is forced to evolve to explain something new. Like maybe you have a world that doesn't believe in supernatural, and one day a portal from another plane opens up and these beings come out. You now need to explain them. You now need to understand what these are and communicate to your friends about them. Faces. This is my shorthand for people. If you're a gamer, you call them NPCs. You call them a character in most other places. However, it's the faces. They evolve the most quickly. And people will say people don't change. But if that's true, that's really them still changing. You have to choose not to react to stimulus given to you. Sentient beings are kind of amazing for this too. We can make really bad choices for ourselves. And it's even a lot more simple to make bad decisions for other people. They are going to change, and you're going to see them change in the course of a story. There's nothing worse to me than a course of a story where characters do not change. Even if it's them being stubborn and refusing to change, that's a choice they're making. Sometimes in stories, the characters become static because you want this archetype. If that's your focus, and that's your version of storytelling, that's fine. However, for me, when I read or watch something or play a video game and the characters don't develop over time, I get bored very quickly and I walk away. The rating for this episode is basic. You need to know how things are going to change in your world. Now, if you want to get into the longer term stuff, it's interesting. It's a good way to learn a lot about the way the world works. Or if you want to tamper with it through magic or technology to make a story, you need to focus a little bit on the long-term stuff. But in your shorter-term stuff, there's, especially if you're doing epic, states and cultures and languages are going to change. If you're doing smaller, more intimate stories, then it might not be the case that those things will change during your story, and probably not. And it might be over the top if they do. If you're doing this small, intimate story about a group of people at an inn talking about their adventures. But the people are going to probably change in every story. So this is where evolution is the most important, and fantasy world building is with the characters. Because that is going to be the thing that changes the most often. It's going to either push a character to get more in line with the cultural norms, or maybe move a little farther away from his cultural norms. The world building task for the day. Pick a culture or a state in your world. Look at the history of them and make notes of what changed to make them the way they are today because of it. So maybe they were invaded a lot, so they became warriors. Maybe they started to invade people, so they became warriors. But look through the major events in the history of a culture or a country and map out how you think the culture would have been a little bit different before. So it's like you're working backwards. And that's the nice thing. When you're problem solving, the easiest way to solve problems is if you know the answer to work back to the problem. So you don't know in this case what the problem is because you don't know what the culture was before, but you know what the formula was because it was the major event that happened. You know the answer because it's where they are. Did they change, and in what ways did they change because of it? The real world task for the day. Sweat some. If you're like me, the first time I wrote this down, I thought, oh, yeah, that plot does make me sweat a little bit. I'm a little lost on what to do. No, I'm not talking about plots. Get up after every 50 minutes, hustle around the house, do some quick housework, run outside, do push-ups, run around the block, don't care, sweat some today. The tease. The next episode, I really start to get into cultures a bit more, and the next several will be about cultures, and we'll be talking about cultural information more specifically. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.